Hello, dear friends in Bulgaria and all over the world, and welcome. We are watching the TV show Visible and Invisible, Counter-Propaganda. I'm SVET DI-NAHUM. Russian aggression against Ukraine has its global implications. Putin's war of choice is destructing the international order and is enormously endangering world peace at a scale unseen since World War II. Today, I'm excited to talk to the United States security and military expert Alex Plitsas on these issues. Alex Plitsas is a full-time executive in the tech sector, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and serves as an elected Justice of the Peace and Fire Commissioner. He is a United States Army Special Operations Combat Veteran and Bronze Star Medal recipient of the Iraqi War and served in Afghanistan as a Defense Civilian Intelligence Officer. He completed his federal service as the Chief of Sensitive Activities for Special Operations and Combating Terror in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Alex attended American University for his undergraduate studies in political science and then graduate school at Johns Hopkins University for global security studies. He also holds a certificate in emergency management from FEMA. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Alex, in your view, what are the direct global implications from Russia's war against Ukraine?
Well, there are a number, unfortunately, and none of them are positive, other than the Russian military depleting itself and exposing itself as a hollow shell. The implications on an economic level are significant, and many of them are related to the food shortages that are created due to the world's largest percentage of grain exports coming from the fertile soil that is in Ukraine and along the Russian border there, which has obviously been disrupted. There have been attempts to get those shipments going, and all of those shipments primarily end up going to developing nations. And so you have a lot of folks who rely on that food and the exports from there in order to sustain themselves. And that's a secondary or tertiary effect as a result of the conflict, where the suffering is not isolated to the battlefields in Ukraine and the civilians in the country, but all across the world, for that matter. And there are also implications beyond this in the sense that if Putin is allowed to get away with this behavior, there are other actors who are similar to him who have unjust grievances or desires to take territory that doesn't belong to them. And if the world does not hold Putin and his regime accountable for their actions, we could see similar types of actions or this conflict spill into neighboring countries, which is why it's imperative for the United States, NATO, and other allies to continue to stand by Ukraine and provide the necessary support for them to defend themselves against completely unjustified Russian aggression and war crimes.
Yeah, and what would be the consequences if the United States Senate declared Wagner Group a terrorist organization?
Excellent question. And it's not a process that's easily understood for many people around the world, but in the United States, among other countries, we have a process for designating groups of individuals or individuals themselves as terrorists, right, who use violence as a means of attempting to achieve some sort of political or policy outcome. So in this case, Wagner has been designated, or will be designated, right, as we move through this, a terrorist organization, and in doing so, that allows the State Department or the Treasury Department to place sanctions against individuals. It also bars people from acting with them. We do have a law against material support to terrorism inside the United States. So any actions that are taken that would financially or otherwise benefit the Wagner Group would also be a crime for those who are supporting them. So this designation is pretty significant in that regard and places them under pretty strict sanctions, which is one of the few measures you could take outside of action. Because in the United States, when we look at policy tools that are available to, say, the President of the United States or another executive, we call it the DIME paradigm. It's an acronym, DIME, so diplomatic, information, military, and economic. So in this case, it's economic sanctions, right? There is some diplomatic effort there to designate them as as a terrorist network. And then finally, what you don't want to end up with is a military conflict over that. But those are the options that remain on the table for the President of the United States.
Okay, that sounds really encouraging for the free world. I'm constantly asking my guests this question. Should Russia be allowed at all to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council?
I mean, I certainly don't think so, in my personal opinion. At an institutional level, right, there are five, for those of you who are not very familiar with the Security Council or the UN process, there are five permanent members of the Security Council, which is the executive governing body per se of the UN, right? And people and countries will rotate on and off of there, except for the permanent five: the United States, China, India, France, and Russia, right? So as you go through that,
actually, it's not India; it's the United Kingdom.
United Kingdom. Sorry, I said India for a second. I'm having a heart attack. Thank you, my friend. Yes.
Well,
so as you go through the five permanent members that are there, any one of them has veto power, so they can stop anything from moving forward. And that was meant to have the global powers after World War II be able to have a bigger say in what goes on across the world, and ensure that a group of rogue nations doesn't get together and basically usurp power and force their will on folks, which may not necessarily be very democratic when you look at it, but was meant as a control measure. Unfortunately, the Russians have taken advantage of that, and they have used that position to veto any actions that are taken against them for things that they are doing which are in clear violation of international law, or anything that would negatively impact them as a result of their actions. So unfortunately, they have all but rendered parts of the UN ineffective by their ability to stop any actions designed to punish Russia for their illegal actions.
And do you think a point might come in which NATO shall be forced to intervene in some way to protect Ukraine, in some way?
So from an intervention perspective, there's a couple of different scenarios which have been floated very publicly in the news, and I think the risk and potential for the conflict to scale is really what's trying to be avoided. So the first thing that was floated would be a no-fly zone, which would involve U.S. or NATO military aircraft overflying Ukraine to ensure that Russian aircraft are not able to fly and strike inside the country, whether that be against military or civilian targets, which is what they've been targeting to date. The thing is, once you do that, those aircraft are now in a combat zone. And if there's a miscalculation, if the Russians, were to fire on one of those aircraft, which, and these types of things do happen in combat, right? There are moments, we call it Clausewitz called it the fog of war, right? And that's what happens when you engage in combat, that sometimes things aren't always clear. And if there is a NATO aircraft that is shot down or whatnot, that could then escalate the conflict to where you now have, potential impact between Russia and NATO, as was evidenced when there was a misunderstanding regarding or confusion rather, regarding the missiles that landed in Poland. There was initially some thoughts that perhaps those were Russian missiles that overshot their targets. It appears to be that those were Ukrainian air defense missiles trying to shoot down incoming Russian missiles, which were aimed at civilian targets and were essentially killing civilians in the area. But the reason that was of such concern is that NATO has in its charter what's called Article 5. And that's the premise of that is generally that an attack on one is an attack on all. So if there's an attack on one NATO member, they can attempt to invoke Article 5, and then all of the members of the alliance are required to come to their aid and send forces to help. And the last time that was done was after 9/11, and the United States invoked it, and that's why we saw NATO member states sending forces of various sizes to Afghanistan over the last 20 years. So that's the risk of escalation there. And I think obviously ground forces and things like that do not seem to be in the cards. I think NATO is looking at Ukraine, as an ongoing conflict that needs to be resolved. That is unjust, but Ukraine is not a NATO member state, and so I think they're going to continue to draw the line at providing material support at this point, and not actually getting engaged themselves, unless there is some sort of catastrophic event at the hands of Russia, whether that be the use of nuclear weapons or things along those lines, which I think President Biden has articulated publicly.
What if Putin attacks NATO country?
If Putin attacks NATO country, then absolutely there'll be an overwhelming military response from NATO. There will be absolutely zero tolerance for any attacks on NATO countries on their soil of any kind, for that matter. The United States has made that clear. We have surged forces into Poland and other countries in the area, just as if nothing else, as a show and reinforcement for our NATO allies that we are committed to our treaty obligations. And Putin would be very, very sorely mistaken to do that. I mean, the Ukrainians and the bravery that they have showed on the battlefield is something that will be studied and admired for centuries to come after this. But most of these folks were shopkeepers or dancers, as we start to see, or musicians who then got a very limited amount of training, but for the protection of their homeland, they went out to go fight, right? They're not professional soldiers. They're doing their job to protect their families and their homes. NATO itself, and look at how well that they're doing it against the Russians right now with just military equipment. if Russia and this hollow shell of an army that's supposed to be a professional army is being beaten and held back by a bunch of civilians who got together and volunteered to defend their homeland, imagine if they had to do that against professional soldiers who've been at war for the last 20 years and actually know how to fight, right? The Ukrainians are holding their own and they're beating them senseless at this point, and they're with a minimal skill level, and they're impressing the entire world watching them. Putin would be very, very sorely mistaken to do something so stupid.
Okay, let us go for a moment to another region of the world, because you are also expert in global security. Earlier this year, I listened to a Pentagon briefing in which the main message was Iran does not want us around. What does that mean? Is there any chance the United States will do something decisive to try to change things in Iran?
Well, there's a couple of different things that are going on at the same time, right? Obviously, over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led alliance in the Middle East, and the greater region for that matter, and then Iran and some of her allies. And then we saw that play out through the Iraq war. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim oppressing a Shia majority inside of his country. And then neighboring Syria next door, you have Bashar al-Assad, who is an Alawite Shia Muslim, 10% of the population, suppressing a majority of Sunni Muslims there. And so that's why you see that very close alliance between Iran, Iraq, and Syria all the way across to southern Lebanon to Hezbollah, because they have that common bond. I mean, the Safavid dynasty converted the Persian people to Shia Islam in the 17th century, and they used scholars from Lebanon to do that. So there's a close tie between a lot of pockets around the Gulf and Iran for that reason, based on religion, which is now transcended into politics and foreign policy. Iran sees our presence in the Middle East, particularly our bases in Saudi Arabia. We have them in the UAE and Qatar, et cetera, in Turkey, as them being surrounded. And think about it, they spent 20 years almost with U.S. forces, in Iraq on one side of their borders, right to the west, and then to the east they have U.S. forces in Afghanistan. So they've felt surrounded for that matter. I personally fought in Baghdad against some of the Shia militias, where there were Iranian Quds Force commanders on the ground who were controlling the forces there. So when Iran doesn't want us around, they want us out of the Middle East. They want us out of their sphere of influence as they see it. They want to control geopolitics, basically from Tehran all the way through the Mediterranean, through southern Lebanon, and be able to control or help control politics in the region. And unfortunately, that regional rivalry, as well as the tensions involving their nuclear program, has spilled over into other conflicts, right? Inside Yemen, right? We have the civil war that's ongoing there between the government and the Houthis, and you have the Saudis taking one side and you have the Iranians taking the other, right? And then we see that in smaller cases in other areas sort of around the Gulf, and then particularly their intervention in Syria on behalf of Assad, as well as in Iraq on behalf of the government there. So what I think is pretty interesting, if you want to talk about the complications of why this is so difficult, inside of Iraq, right, we had the Islamic State terrorist group, which was attempting to take over the country, right? So inside of Iraq, the United States, Iran, and Iraq were all fighting against ISIS to try to sustain the Iraqi government, which was democratically elected, but is a Shia government, unlike Saddam's government, and therefore the Iranians have been trying to make sure that stays the case so that they've got an ally. But obviously there's been some tension recently about Iran meddling in the internal politics in Iraq. Now go next door to Syria, right? Iran is also allied with the government there, where the United States is not allied with Assad. So in Iraq, you have the Russians and the Syrians, the Russians and the Iranians helping to back Assad to keep him in power, while also fighting or trying to fight ISIS. Then you have the United States and the Kurds on the ground trying to fight ISIS. But in the background, there's also still that conflict between Russia and Iran, and then the United States and the Kurds in the background. So in one country on one side, we're all allied against ISIS. You go to the next country next door and we're allied against ISIS, but we're not allied with each other. So, I mean, it's a mess from one country to the other. There is no clear, outcome at this point. And the biggest concern is the nuclear program and the fact that they continue to enrich uranium, that there is no, I think at this point, there is no real clear deal that's feasible that's on the table. And I think there's a concern between Israel and the United States that at some point this could lead to a military strike, which would obviously be the last outcome anybody wants. I've been three tours in 2 different wars. I've been to 42 countries and a lot of third world hotspots. The last thing I want to see is a conflict anywhere else in the world, to see any more people suffering. But at some point there will be a red line where the Iranians will be held accountable for their continued desire to illegally develop nuclear weapons.
And yeah, from your very clear points, very interesting for the public, directly comes the next question. What do you think? How good are the declared perfect relations between Russia and China? Are there any grounds for a strategic disagreement between them? Recently, the Chinese President Xi Jinping made a major visit to the Middle East, and he called it a new era.
Sure. There's a elephant in the room when it comes to Russia and China, particularly in light of what's going on in Ukraine. China has made they haven't tried to hide the fact that their one China policy views Taiwan as part of mainland China. And as a result of that, at some point, they would obviously like to take the country back. I think there's open speculation at some point that they would like to do so by military force if necessary, if the Taiwans decide that they're not going to join China at will, which is where we've been politically for quite some time. So China's stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? They look at the Russian actions in Ukraine, the war crimes, the raping, the torturing, the executions, and everything else, and the need as a rising global superpower to be able to speak out against those actions. At the same time, when they're looking at a potential or similar action, maybe hopefully sans the war crimes of wanting to take back Taiwan, Russia has a long memory, and if they are not getting the support they need from China now, or at least if China doesn't remain neutral throughout this conflict, I think China sees the long-term implication of that for themselves. And so that's the big challenge that's there. And I think, China also has massive trade with Europe, the United States, and other places that they wouldn't want to see disrupted as a result of this ongoing fight in Ukraine. And so their support for Russia has been extremely limited. There are some shows of support, like you said, some of the statements that have been made. But when push comes to shove, everything's about the almighty dollar at some point. And unfortunately, I think from a trade perspective, that's where the Chinese will eventually land on this particular issue. But I don't think we're going to see them take a hard stance on Russia again, unless Putin does something so wildly out of bounds in non-conformance with international law and standards. Which is hard to imagine there's anything more he could do at this point. I was in Ukraine a month ago. I met with some of the victims, and I've been to war numerous times. I've seen some pretty awful stuff, or at least I thought I had. I have never seen anything like this in my life. The barbarity, the inhumanity, and the cruelty that these Russian soldiers have shown in their actions inside of Ukraine is beyond anything I could have possibly imagined. And there is no way you get an 18-year-old kid from the middle of Russia, somewhere else, who hasn't really traveled anywhere, who goes into a village or a town outside of a city in Ukraine and decides that they are going to sexually assault women that they've never seen, some young girls, some old women, torture people and kill them, unless they are kind of brainwashed to do so via propaganda. And that's why the propaganda is so dangerous, because it's what's fueling these war crimes. Normal people don't do things like this.
Is the military aid for Ukraine sufficient enough, though? Is there any chance for providing Ukraine with attacking capabilities?
You mean attacking inside of Russia?
Attacking in terms of that the military experts right now say that the Russian army right now has gone to the trenches for a long period.
Yes. Yeah, so we're on the same page there. I just want to clarify to make sure I understood your question. So thank you for providing the clarity. The trench warfare is something obviously that's been unseen in this scale since World War I almost, because it's so ridiculous. You've got infantry troops entrenched, they're dug in, and then you've got artillery fire that's kind of going back and forth on both sides. Now, the HIMARS and some of the others, which are precision strike systems, are providing the Ukrainians with some offensive capabilities they didn't previously have. And they launched that massive counteroffensive to the north and east to take back Kharkiv and the region, pushing back towards the Russian border, where the Ukrainians have recovered about 50% of their territory. And I think to your point, yes, that there is a need for additional offensive military hardware to continue that push. And again, the United States has chosen this policy line for whatever reason, that they don't want to provide certain systems because they're worried about attacks inside of Russia. If the systems are capable of striking that far outside of Ukrainian territory. And I think there's a fear that that would be seen as an escalation in Russia and justification for the use of tactical nuclear weapons or something along those lines. So it's trying to strike this balance between ensuring the Ukrainians have what they need to defend themselves and win, but also not escalating the conflict to where this becomes, truly World War III. Which is essentially being fought in Ukraine only. But as you mentioned earlier, that's potentially how it expands to neighboring countries.
Do you expect any change in U.S. policy toward China in January next year when the new Congress shall be summoned? And if so, how that would impact the relations between the United States and Russia?
So that's a great question. We're already starting to see some of those changes now. So the incoming speaker assumed it would be Kevin McCarthy, who is a Republican, as you mentioned. We're seeing a control change in the House. In the United States, we have two legislative bodies. We have the House of Representatives and we have the United States Senate. In the Senate, there are 2 senators for every state. So 50 states gives us 100 senators. 435 members of Congress, and that's on the House of Representatives, and that's determined by population. So there's a lot more members of the House. But what's unique to the House of Representatives, among other things, is that all funding bills, any bills to spend money, have to originate in the House of Representatives, not the Senate. So that'll be under Republican control, right? So that's from a budgetary perspective. That's how there'll be some impact. And then assumed Speaker McCarthy, incoming anyway, also mentioned that he would put together a standing committee on China, and particularly deal with some of the things like intellectual property theft and other actions they're taking for currency manipulation. So China has been very vocal in their opposition and anger towards U.S. policies, that are calling out the currency manipulation and things along those lines on an international stage. They find some of it to be hypocritical, but the United States is stuck to its guns. So I think there'll be a little bit more in your face, holding folks accountable from the House of Representatives than you've seen now, because the foreign policy of the United States it's obviously the prerogative of the president in terms of, being the commander in chief, being in charge of all the executive departments and agencies, including the State Department, appointing the Secretary of State, and our foreign policy as a country in general comes from the White House. Congress's role is oversight, but they also have the ability to fund. And then the Senate is also needed to confirm any ambassadors or things along those lines from a checks and balances perspective. So with Democrats in control of the House and the Senate, for the most part, they'll stand firmly behind the president of their party. It would be the same as if a Republican was in, unless they were doing something truly crazy. So what you will see is, I think, a little bit more partisan activity where folks will be not only looking to hold China accountable, but then also, I think, really push the Biden administration to do more in areas where they think they're being too soft, per se.
Okay, I have a couple of more questions. First of all, in the recent years, we all could see more engagement of the free world in the region of Central Asia. Do you think Russia still has its control over Central Asia region, over the former USSR republics there?
So I know, Putin, when he was in charge of the intelligence services, had stood up directorates that were responsible for some of those former Soviet satellite states. We saw that one of those failed miserably in Ukraine in terms of their, desire to stand up an opposition government there, which didn't really happen. I know, particularly from experience in Afghanistan over the last year and a half during the withdrawal, that the Russian intelligence services are very active in the Central Asian states, the stands, as we call them, that used to be part of the Russian Federation back in the day. So the Russian intelligence services are still active to the extent that they're controlling things. I don't think it's as much as people perceive, but I think there's also an understanding from many of those folks. If you look at some of the votes that have taken place in the UN, you won't see yeses or no votes for or against Russia in the Central Asian states. These be part of the Federation. You'll see them abstaining and remaining neutral, very similar to China. So that's where it's also kind of odd. But there's other stuff you'll see in the background too that's not really talked about in the news. So the United States and NATO have our own caliber of weapons and equipment and everything else that's not compatible with Russian. So, for example, if you've seen a U.S. M4, M16 rifle, the civilian equivalent would be, an AR-15 with your .556 caliber bullet. And then you have an AK-47 standard assault rifle on the Russian side, right, with your 7.62 caliber. So the weapon systems themselves are not interchangeable, the ammunition, the munitions, et cetera. The United States doesn't sit on some large stockpile of Soviet caliber munitions, right? We have no need to, because that's not what fuels or our military. It's not what they use. So where those weapons are produced are mostly in former Soviet satellite states, right? So to try to get end user certificates and permission to export those things from countries around the world, what we're seeing in many cases, the observations are that a lot of those countries are denying the end user certificates and not allowing things to be shipped out, not because they're against Ukraine per se, but they don't want to be seen as taking a side or be providing ammunition or munitions to the Ukrainians. because it'll be seen as an escalation with the Russians. So there's a lot more going on in the background that's less obvious because it isn't supporting Russia or supporting, Ukraine or vice versa, and not supporting one or the other. But in the remaining neutral and not doing anything at all is actually having an impact as well in terms of, the example I gave you, it happens to be weapon shipments. But that's also on the diplomatic and economic side as well. So I think, what was it, Churchill's quote there, right, about, remaining neutral in times of of moral crisis, right, is the greatest sin there, right? And that's what we're seeing from a lot of these countries.
Absolutely. And here comes the final question. Does the world really understand that a lot is at stake in Ukraine right now? A lot is at stake.
So in terms of the world, I think a lot of global powers understand at what's stake. The average person out there couldn't find, Ukraine on a map. If you actually labeled it and put their finger on top of it, they still wouldn't recognize that's what it was. I try to explain to folks when you talk to them here in the United States, for a means of comparison, if you look at the length of the front lines, it's basically from Toronto, Canada, down to Raleigh, North Carolina, like 1,300 miles or something crazy. It is a massive conflict in terms of the size and scale, and that's just understanding the conflict itself. And to your point, do people really understand the secondary and tertiary effects of this conflict, the potential to spill over, and what could happen if money or weapons are cut off for Ukraine and they're unable to defend themselves? And no, I don't think many people do. I mean, we're, again, going to see a hostile Russia right on the border with Poland and other nations that are there, NATO member states, and people who have, tracts of territory that the Russians believe, belong to them, right? I mean, right next door, to Ukraine, there are Russian troops that are sitting there in a defensive position, 6,000 of them, I believe. And I always mispronounce the name. So if you can help me, Transnistria, I forget exactly how to pronounce it.
Transnistria is in English, yeah.
Thank you. All right, good. It's like I'm close. Yes, I mean, there are border conflicts all over, but this is not unique, right? So we've seen this before, and we've seen what happens when no action is taken. I was in Iraq in 2008 when I was coming back from my 2 weeks of leave, and I arrived back in Baghdad, and there are 2,000 Georgian troops on the airfield. And I'm looking around, and I asked somebody, what's going on? Where are the Georgians going? They said they're going back to Georgia because the Russians invaded and they started a war there. So, it was, again, all over nonsense, right? And this is, there are some provinces in northern Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, right, which were, there are some ethnic Russians. And so Putin has tried to use basically the same line from Stalin from World War II, that there is, that his job is to protect the Russian-speaking ethnic Russian diaspora wherever they happen to exist in pockets. And so what we saw happen in Georgia, that went unchecked from the United States and from the rest of the allies, right, for the most part, we really didn't do much in response. People will claim we did a lot. We absolutely did not, right? And the same thing with Crimea in 2014, right, when, whatchamacallit, when we had, when the Russians came in and they wanted Sevastopol to make sure they were able to get the headquarters as well for the Black Fleet and make sure that they were able to sustain their Navy in the winter, because it's the, the closest warm water port to counter NATO in the Mediterranean, right, is from there. So when they came in, again, we really didn't do much. And in each case, what did we see? We saw Russian propaganda, which both domestically in Russia, which was meant for their audiences to support Putin, right? And then also inside Ukraine, where they made it look like there were these, ethnic Ukrainian anti-Russian fascists that were running around assaulting and killing people, and that the hub of this activity was in, Western Ukraine, and it was being supported by NATO. I was in Ukraine in January and February of 2014. I was there when the Maidan was on fire, when the president fled, and I was in Lviv, out in the west where the supposedly hub of activity was. There was nothing going on. There were tourists milling about, buying chocolates and shopping in stores. Like, this was all utter and complete nonsense that the Russians created. And the reason that they did it is they created a narrative that there was this fictitious threat that needed to be dealt with. And so the Russian intelligence services come in. They helped to prop up an opposition movement in the regions that Russia wants to at that point take over, right, which is in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas area now, which is which is spoken about. And in doing so, they prop up this opposition government, who then says, "Hey, we're under threat. We're going to invite the Russian forces in to come provide security and protect us." So Russia creates the threat. They prop up a non-existent government that they're pulling the strings on, a puppet government, and then their troops are brought in afterwards. It's basically a way of conducting an invasion without actually firing a shot. That was a fundamental change in warfare that we saw in 2014, and it largely went unchecked. And I also think, Russia at that point saw the value of using, deception, or, in this case, misinformation, as we'll call it, or propaganda applied to an adversary, and being able to achieve strategic results at very little cost and no risk to them from inside Russia. And I believe the success in 14, that the fact that they won unchallenged, and that, information campaigns that don't result in some sort of physical act of violence where somebody's hurt goes unchecked, that was the motivation for them to interfere in the United States in 2016 in our presidential election, right? And they saw, again, for very little money, how they could sow societal discord inside the United States, which is why they try to do it again in 2020. So again, to your point, if the world does not start to recognize the potential risks of this conflict spilling out of Ukraine, and more importantly, as you've mentioned and we've spoken about, the propaganda, in getting that under control and not allowing the propagandists to operate, we're going to be in trouble. And the last point I'll make on that really quickly, sorry, I know I've been on a diatribe here, is the propagandists have operated with impunity, right? In the United States, this has devolved into some ridiculous conversation about whether or not we can regulate people's speech on Twitter. It's too late at that point. Once someone has introduced information into the information environment, it's too late. It's out there and it can be discussed. And, according to our laws anyway, unless you yell, fire in a crowded theater, as the example from the Supreme Court, where you're going to incite violence or things of that nature, you have protected free speech. As I like to say, you have a right to be a moron. You want to be an idiot online, you have the right to do so. And if we don't get to the root cause of where this is coming from and hold the propagandists accountable, right, it's too late. They're going to continue to file all of that stuff or throw it into the public space and then let it be discussed. And then we're stuck trying to deal with the after effects, which is impossible to control. So it's a really precarious situation in which we find ourselves.
Okay, this is a great finale. And Alex, I thank you so much for your fascinating and quite experienced and fascinating, amazing interview. I hope we will have the chance to continue this conversation in the future. Thank you so much, Alex.
You're welcome. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. This has been my exclusive interview with Mr. Alex Plitsas from the Atlantic Council. I'm looking forward to continuing interviewing global security experts from all over the world. I thank you all for being together tonight with Visible and Invisible Counter-Propaganda with me, SVET DI-NAHUM. I will see you next time. Until then, you may like, follow, and share our Visible and Invisible Facebook page, follow me on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or support us on Patreon. Thank you all. Stay cool as usual. Have a good one.